Hello, and welcome to the Step Stories podcast. I'm your host, Robin Breuner, and I'm here today with my dear friend, Erin Becker. Hi, Erin.
Hi,
Hi.
Robin.
Thank you for
Hello,
being
hello.
here. What?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I said hello, hello, and thank you so much for letting me share my story. I hope it's of use.
Well, I know it'll be of use because I know you, and you put wisdom out into the world. So I'm looking forward to sharing your story, and I really appreciate you coming on and doing it. So I just wanted to say a little bit about you to the people listening. And I know you, and you are modest, and this will embarrass you, because you have so many talents. You, in fact, are, in my opinion, one of my most talented friends and people in my life. And you're an artist, you're a poet, you're a designer, you're a gardener, you're an amazing floral arranger, and on top of all of those outward artistic creative talents, you're deeply spiritual. And I so appreciate that about you. I love our conversations. And we have a lot of them. And so today I wanted to talk to you about your experiences growing up as a stepchild. And we talked a little bit about this ahead of time. And I know Erin wants to come at this from a place of um, not trauma, but more the gifts it gave her. So I will let you talk about that. But before we start going into your background, and I'm doing all the talking, I want to talk about you now. And I know you're the mother
Go.
of 3 grown children, and you're even a new, I can't believe it, you're a grandmother. You're so young. But tell me a little bit about your life right now. What's going on with you?
Well, I'm just in a really lucky place. I have a life that has gifted me with so many choices. So I get to pretty much have the privilege and luxury of doing things I love and being with my family and friends. Those are probably the most important things. And as you mentioned, I love art. I love gardening. I love hiking. I love political activism. Um, I love to spend time with my community. So I'm in a really gifted place of pretty much being able to choose what I want to do and how I want to spend my time.
Well, and you give a lot back to the world. And I was trying to remember. My producer Scott was saying, "How did you two meet?" And I honestly can't remember. We have a lot of mutual friends, and have known each other
Yeah.
for a while. Our kids know each other. But do you remember how we met? I don't.
No, I don't have like a memory of of the time, but I know that our paths have crossed, through kids primarily is what brought us together. And our desire to have a family, raise a family, and be in community. And I think we share that value. So I think that's why we're so attracted to each other.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, also one of the things that's very interesting about your background, and I want to talk about this at the end of our conversation. But your husband Rob had he was a stand-up comedian when you were first married, and he wrote and starred in this incredible one-man show on Broadway called Defending the Caveman, and it became the longest running show on Broadway. And I want to talk about what it was like being a young wife and mother during that time, and how your earlier experiences informed how you handled that. So anyway, we're going to get to that later, but I want to talk a little bit now about your background and where'd you grow up? Where'd you grow
I
up?
actually grew up in Marin. I was born and raised here, generationally from here. I moved about, and like you said, with Rob's career and my career, it allowed us to move around the country and to experience other cultures, really other cultures. When you grow up in Marin and then you move to other parts of the United States, it's culturally so different. Um, After growing up here, we traveled a bit as a couple and young family, but my roots are really in Marin. My roots and my pride are really in Marin, and how lucky I feel to have had so much nature around me and family. Cousins were really important. generational friendships that my parents had were really important. So I grew up in a tight knit community, and Marin back in the day was a much more eclectic environment than you see now.
Mm.
So I had
Well,
a variety of experiences with friends.
and just for anybody who's listening for the first time, Marin is Marin County, and it is just across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. And I've lived here for about 25 years, but back in the day, it was famous for a lot of musicians lived here, hippies. It was wild times,
Yeah, and
but
even
a beautiful space.
yeah,
Yeah.
even before that, it was probably in my parents' generation. It was really common for folks that were first generation immigrants to move to Marin to raise their family. So it really was a working class. Of course, there were pockets of privilege, but it had a much more variety of economic and basically melanin.
And a lot of, creativity, a lot of nature, um, and a lot of open space back then, right?
Yeah. In open space, I have to give a shout out to those rebels with a cause that secured this open space. Point Reyes National Seashore, San Francisco, um, uh, recreation, all that was done by folks that were common folks in Marin who preserved the land and saw the importance of the health and nature of preserving that. So, growing up in an environment where there was activism, where there was appreciation for nature, where the common folks could do really extraordinary things, I think really shaped me. Mrs. Twilliger, she's known for being like this artist that would go into schools and teach kids about ecology. So I grew up in what I would say outside my family unit was a really healthy relationship with community and nature.
And I think Marin has kept for the most part, it's had its changes, but it's kept a lot of that, and I think due to the early efforts of people to wanna keep it that way. So, anyway, we're both very lucky. We know, we both get it, that we live here and enjoy the nature but let's talk about your family because that is why we're here to talk about blended families, and you definitely have that in spades. Um, so
Yes.
let's go back to you being a little girl and what was it like for you? Yeah, tell me about your
It was,
family.
Yeah, I'd love to. I have a really great family. I love my family. Um, my parents were married out of college. They were local and they were married and they loved each other very much and had 5 kids. I was the only girl, second oldest, and 4 boys, and grew up in a home that clearly there was love there, but there was, the unfortunateness of alcoholism. And so while I knew my parents loved each other very much, the chaos of alcoholism really eroded our family. Um, my parents got divorced. My dad did not want to get divorced. My parents got divorced. And I want to really speak to that because it was in the early 70s. And in 1969-ish, something like that, I think California was one of the first states to have I don't know the law term, but it's like an uncontested divorce. So you saw a huge rise of divorce for folks my age. And so we grew up with this kind of new thing of divorce. And there was some shame around it, especially growing up in a really strong Irish Catholic home. Getting a divorce was just really not it was a horrible thing to do. So that being said, I think it was one of the healthiest things my mom did. And, I think it was one of the things that really, um, broke some cycles, some family dynamics and some cycles. And, while it was incredibly traumatic, incredibly hard, and I don't wanna, really go into the details of the trauma and drama of that because from that really hard decision and really painful decision, um, I was able to, as an adult, really pick that apart, and I think because of that trauma and drama, I have a richer life. And I think that's something that, step families have an advantage over conventional families. And go with me on this because it's kind of an odd way to think about it.
Yeah, but I
But
I love your thinking.
one of the things that uh, gets overlooked of having a step family and having the trauma of a quote unquote broken family is that every family, whether you're in a healthy family, a broken family, a dysfunctional family, non-conventional, whatever, every family is going to have challenges, sometimes trauma, pain, whatever it is. And I think one of the secret insights that I got coming from a step family or coming from a divorced family is that it was a permission slip that I often wonder if conventional families don't get, meaning that if you're raised in a conventional family and you experience trauma or pain, there isn't in my opinion, the permission slip of exploring that and healing that, then maybe there would be in a family that's a divorced family or a step family. And I say that because you oftentimes will hear people say, "Oh, I had a really great childhood," or "I was raised in a really good environment. I don't know why I'm having these issues." And I don't know that there's necessarily the permission slip to explore them. Whereas if you're from a step family or a blended family, people are like, oh, well, that's because of your childhood. Oh, that's because. So it gives you an avenue on to exploration and healing. And that's the part that was kind of the surprise for me.
That's such an interesting way to look at it and a wise way to look at it, and, I actually had a conversation with somebody last night who had listened to a previous podcast of mine, and they said, "Wow, I feel so guilty. That person had such a hard time, and I came from everything was fine in my family, and I don't know why I'm having these problems." So I think that there's this guilt that if things were fine for you, you're not allowed to have your own story and your own experience, and there's degrees of that, right? I mean, every
Well, and
it's
I
all
don't
relative.
Right,
Yeah,
and I don't think that there's an Olympics for it. So you don't
right.
get a bronze one because, it was only 2 kids or you only got spanked on occasion, and then you get the gold one for whatever. I don't think it's an Olympic that way. Trauma is trauma, and people process it
Exactly.
however they process it. But
That's
for me,
right.
I think having come from a clearly, traumatic situation was really, an opportunity to either repeat it or an invitation to heal it and live a deeper life.
That's it's very true, and it is a choice, but I think that anyway, I don't wanna go down that path because you, have done a lot of work, I know, and you are mentally, you've been working at that. You're mentally what's the word I wanna say? Stable is the wrong word, but I think that a lot of people come out of
I think it's an
these
ongoing
traumas, and it's hard for them to make that choice.
Yeah, I think that it's an ongoing process. It's a continuous process and it's like an onion. You're layering it, you're pulling apart the layer. But the other part that I don't want to bypass the pain. I don't want to bypass the emotions, the gamut of emotions I had around the divorce and what that consequences of that was. And then having a blended family and the consequences of that. I'm not bypassing that. But what I really am noticing is that it's an opportunity that a lot of folks don't get to pursue healing. And so I'm grateful for that. And I also really honor um, that a hard decision doesn't necessarily mean it was the wrong decision. So for my mom to divorce my dad was an incredibly painful, hard decision, but I don't believe it was the wrong decision.
Well, let's go back and if you don't mind, talk a little bit just kind of about the actual story and what happened, the more micro picture. You were the second oldest and you were the only girl. So do you feel that your role in the family was a little bit more like an oldest as the only female and being in the birth order a little older? Or did you get lost in the shuffle of
I
all the
don't
brothers?
Yeah, I'm not really clear on that. I It's so funny because oftentimes people will say, "Oh, you were the only girl, you must have been a princess." No, I think I was, like, the 5th boy, you know? It was like it was more that I wanted to be a part of it, I had to be a part of it. That being said, I think that perhaps maybe conventional caretaking things for my younger brother would be put on me, just conventional cultural expectations. So yeah, my gender probably had a part to do with that. Also, just survival had a part to do with that. There were certain caretaking roles I had to do for my younger brothers when my parents were divorced that, were really just about survival. So gender, survival, trauma, who knows what it is. But I grew up with, an older brother and then another brother. We're only 13 months apart and we're really close.
Yeah, you
And then
are.
there's a big gap. I have some younger brothers and they're almost like, they're not my children, but there's definitely a really different connection and care and worry and kind of those things that you ascribe to someone that might be an aunt or a mother versus a sister. Yeah.
Well, and interestingly enough, I know that you're very close to your nieces. Which brothers'
Yeah.
girls are those? Is that your the one?
My My 2 youngest brothers,
Okay,
there's a big gap. They had kids younger, and it was almost like we were grandparents to them. They're
okay.
yeah, so they yeah. And then my parents got divorced, and we had a big, I went from really having a close Irish Catholic family with cousins and church and grandma and all that to my mom doing this terrible thing in their eyes. And it was a real harsh disconnection. They really stepped back from our lives. And that was an isolating and upsetting um, time period.
How old were
And
you,
then we
Erin?
lived in
How old were you then?
I was probably around 10 or 11, something like
Okay.
that. And it was really a really hard time because not only financially, but we had to move, because of financial reasons. And so I had that isolation from my cousins and my family, and then financial shifts that were so different. And we had to move, and we lived in kind of a charming neighborhood to an area where I was bused into kind of a tougher neighborhood. So that was really jarring.
Mm. Did your
And
siblings
then it
did
was
your
a good.
wait 1 sec. Did your siblings go with you, when you went to the were you bused to
Yeah,
the
we
different
all were
schools?
together. We all moved in with my mom, and my mom had to go back to school. We went on government aid. We really had a shift in responsibilities as siblings and the way we lived. My mom was pretty tenacious to make that choice and then to have to re-educate herself so that she could be a solo provider. So that was a pretty tenacious thing to do and a good role model to do. The consequences of that were a lot of caretaking fell on my brothers and myself for my younger brothers, and a childhood that was really framed around being responsible and
How old were
blending
the
in.
littlest guys? How old were the littlest guys when that happened?
They were probably like 2 and 6, something like that, 2 and 4, something like that. Yeah, they were really little.
Really little. Were you, before the divorce happened, were you aware that your dad had a drinking problem?
Yeah, because, there was such chaos, and, yeah, it just created financial and family chaos. And we were really lucky back in the day, in that time period in the early 70s. The idea of understanding alcoholism as a disease was a new thing. So we were really lucky in that we were informed that it wasn't our fault or all those kinds of things. But even though we got that input, kids still can't help but process if I was different, maybe that wouldn't have happened.
Mm.
But at least we were exposed to the idea that it was a disease and that my dad deserved compassion.
You okay, you were exposed to that, honestly, at 10 or 11, you must have had a lot of if you're hearing that and you're seeing what's going on and you're seeing the pain and the separation from family and all the things that went along with that, did you really were you able to really think that at that time? Can you remember, or was it just completely confusing or a
No,
struggle?
I think it's just all part of the disease of alcoholism. It's confounding, it's baffling. I don't think I absolutely don't think that there was anything in my psyche at that time except to somehow find a way to create calm amidst this chaos. And I think that's where I became really hyper responsible. Um, and yeah, that's the disease of alcoholism, whether you stay married or not. It creates, a completely confounding, um, situation for family and friends.
So you're so you
The
do you
chaos.
think that your coping mechanism was to, like you said, become uber responsible for your siblings? Did you feel uber responsible for your mom? Or did
Absolutely. I think what
Yeah,
happens just like a real cliff note version of alcoholism or the dynamics of alcoholism and codependency is basically what happens is a person stops considering themselves and looks to the outside to create some sort of predictability, calmness, safety, whatever. Because in the dynamic, at least in my family, and generally most alcoholic homes, safety is gone. A child's sense of safety, of predictability is gone, and so a child needs to have safety to be able to get in touch with themselves, to be able to relax into normal developmental stages. But for me, that was interrupted. And so for my safety was interrupted. So I went from a normal childhood experience um, of just normal development because my environment was safe to the idea that my environment is not safe. So I started really seeking outside sources to solve that. So I became hyper responsible, um, just super um, productive and really good at making things nice, finding a place to make it nice.
interesting. Even at that young age. I mean,
Absolutely.
I'm relating to this because my mom died when I was 10, and that's when my father got remarried when I turned 11. So I was the same age as you, and I was the oldest daughter. Um, and so I'm just listening to you and thinking about myself. And I think I was always kind of that way anyway, because I think, the old eldest daughter syndrome that seems to be everywhere right now. But I think that I was that way somewhat anyway. But I think, trying to remember back, but I think that ramped up for me too. I mean, it's a way of control.
Yeah, if you're a
It's a way
child,
of control,
if you're a child,
perfectionism, right?
but yeah, it's a faulty belief. So the idea is that if you're a child and your safety is interrupted, that's an extremely traumatic situation. So you
Hmm.
seek to find safety. We get these kind of faulty beliefs of where safety lies. Safety lies in tidiness. Safety lies in performance. Safety lies in being small. Safety lies wherever we, as children, in our little childhood minds, think this is going to solve it. This is going to give me some sort of security and safety. So any interruption, whether it's a death, a divorce, a war, a trauma, whatever it is that in my opinion, I'm not a psychologist, just from my own personal discovery, that when safety is interrupted, we as little kids do really little kid reasonings of way to find that safety, acceptance, and love.
Hmm.
Yeah.
No, it's so true.
So then that was just that real chunk of my life where you would say the trauma was really and then
Yeah, let's
my
talk
mom
about what
fell in love with
happened. Yeah. Go
yeah.
ahead. Sorry, I
And then my
interrupted you.
mom fell That's fine. My mom fell in love with somebody, and they got married, and he had 4 daughters.
And how long was
And
that after the divorce, Erin?
probably, like, 5 years,
Okay.
something like that, 4 years, something like that. That's a sign of trauma, right? I can't really have the exact time periods, but, it was about 4 or 5 years, something like that. And then he had 4 girls, and they were most of them were older, one was a year younger, and then some moved in. They ended up buying a house together, and, some of them moved in, some didn't, and that was another kind of layer because, um that was really having to understand, and this is where the gift comes. I see the gift now. At the time, I was just like, "What the heck? I don't understand this." I had to figure out other cultures, other ways of behaving. I came from 4 boys, and if, culturally, maybe it's just my family, maybe it's gender specific, but if boys were mad at you, they'd be like, "I'm mad at you," and they might punch you, or might push you, or might say, "That's not right," or it's a much more direct and then it's done. And then having 4 sisters, I never had anybody steal my clothes before. I never had anybody, like, triangulate and get in a fight about something I said that hurt their feel and, like, that whole girl culture was also really, like, "Wow, what is this?" So, again, like, in looking back, uh, yeah, it was stressful, it was traumatic, but it also has given me kind of perspective and skills on acclimating to new cultures. And even things around we have a step family, one of the things is how do you blend culture? How do you blend family dinners? How do you blend chores around the house? How do you blend um these are two different cultures, two different spaces, and how do you blend that? And figuring that out was a huge challenge. And reconciling fairness and unfairness, and I mean that was a really big challenge. My dad, it's really interesting because my stepdad, uh, his approach, and I think my mom's approach to being step parents were probably a little more placating. We're probably a little more walking on shells. We need to be sensitive around them. A little, uh, they probably had probably more fluid boundaries than, say, my dad and stepmom when they got married. My dad ended up going into recovery and getting married to my stepmom, who I love very much, and I learned so much from her. But I remember the first time I met her versus the first time I met my stepdad. So the first time I met my stepmom, my dad would rent a beach house, and we would, as kids, come out maybe during one of his weekends or something that we had it, and we had heard about his quote unquote lady friend, and
Wait, stop for
and
I'm gonna
he
stop you for 1 second. How where time-wise, when was this? Like, your mom got remarried, was your dad
was
remarried?
probably simultaneous to my dad mom getting married. My dad was dating this, and this is the only person we ever heard about. And,
And you're about 14,
and I
15?
re yeah,
You're right,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah. And remember my dad, we had this excuse me, we had this, rental that on the beach, and that my dad said that he was, gonna have his lady friend over. And so, of course, we had a different experience with my stepdad, who the first time we met him, he was like, took us each out, gave us a gift. There was like a kind of a cloyingness to it. And I remember the first time Patty came, we were sitting kind of just outside the beach house in the sand. And my dad, I could tell he was a little nervous or whatever. And he said, "Hey kids, oh, this is Patty." And she had like a little beach bag from, probably 1960s Acapulco. And she's kind of fancy, and she wore like frosted lipstick, and she was a little decorated, much in contrast to my mom, who's much more pragmatic. So I was kind of like, "Woo." And it's so funny because she had her little beach bag and she said, "Hello, hello, Erin." She said, "Hello." She was just like very, "Hello, I'm going to the beach if you'd like to join me." And she just walked down to the beach. I remember us as kids were like, "What the heck?" And something I learned from that was so, like, put it in my pocket, especially when I had teenage kids. She really owned herself. She owned her power. She didn't, in my opinion, use her guilt for divorce or step parent. She didn't have shame around things that then kind of skewed the relationship or created compensatory behavior. She just really showed up as herself. And I
When you
really think
when you
that was a
well, what let's okay, so you're being so generous in everything you're saying, and, you're I feel like talking a little bit at a high level, which I love about you, but I wanna get a little bit dirty. I wanna know, like, how did that feel with her? Like, so you're saying there was I can't even say the word, compensatory behavior. What are we talking about? Like, what was it like?
Well, I think that, for some reason, I felt safe with Patty, and I didn't with my stepdad as much. And I think that's because if you are in such chaos with all these blended families and this personality and that personality and this rule, and if you have placating parents or parents that are guilt-ridden and then overcompensate by leniency or indulgence, um, I think as a kid that felt unsafe.
Mm.
For me, the safety was because Patty presented herself as, "This is who I am, this is what I like, this is what flies, this is what doesn't fly." Not in any sort of sergeant kind of way, but in just a very clear way of showing up for who she is and what she likes, doesn't like, her sensibilities, what she values.
And setting
And there wasn't
boundaries,
a
sounds like.
yeah,
She
and
set boundaries.
there was a bit of addiction in my family. A lot of my step siblings had addiction. And so there was a bunch of addiction and all the messiness that comes from that, the broken hearts that come from it, the chaos that comes from it, the drama that comes from it. But what I appreciated and is that again, I felt safe because I think she showed up with honesty and without this kind of uh I'm assuming parental guilt, and so I need to be lenient or they're having a hard time. And there was no playing like, you know, sugar daddy weekends, kind of like I'm going to be the shining parent. There's a confidence in her that was quiet, and she didn't have necessarily all the things that maybe my mom had or stepdad had or whatever. She just really possessed herself. And that was a really important lesson to really see how owning her personality, and not respond out of shame around divorce and such and mushy boundaries created safety. It's almost counterintuitive. These parents are, like I could just speak for myself. It's like, oh, they're having a hard time, go easy on them. Or, oh, I think that somehow creates such fuzziness and unsafety. So as a kid, I appreciated that.
That's so interesting, and I'm really listening to you thinking about other people listening to this, and, that's a different spin that I've heard, and I really like it, and I'm thinking about my own stepmothers, one in particular, very similar to what you're describing, and it's great for me to see a different perspective, to see it from a different perspective, and I think it's interesting to see it from you, having been the stepchild, being able to see it that way, but I think you're seeing it now
I think
looking
I
back,
think
right?
the other thing too is that there's an expression, mean what you say, but don't be mean. And I think that's what she really practiced. She really represented who she was, what she valued, what she didn't. She was not lacking empathy for what we were going through, but there wasn't what I would call a shame compensatory behavior, that I think I could see in dynamics in my other kind of side of the step.
Do you think your brothers had the same attitude as you, the same feelings? I mean, it's kinda hard to lump 4 other people into one thing, but generally, were they aligned with you?
I think I would say that, like in a family that's a conventional family that isn't broken by death or divorce, I think that each child, depending upon where they are in their development and where the parents are in their development, each child gets a different parent. Me as a 3-year-old is going to be different than my brother as a 3-year-old because uh, my parents weren't as mature as they were with my brother. So I don't know. I don't know. I know there's fondness for her. Yeah, but I can't speak for them.
Did she have kids?
Yeah, she had 4 kids. She had 3 daughters and a son, and I actually
Gosh.
lived yeah, talk about wonky. I lived so imagine there's my mom who remarried, my dad who remarried. They each have kids. My stepmom's daughter lived with us in my family of my stepdad and my mom.
Wow. Wow.
So there was a really fluidity, and I think that my mom and my dad really valued family, and I think even within their step relationships, they facilitated that
Mm,
for us. And I
that's
think that's an example of it. The other thing was neither of my parents or step parents ever badmouthed the other parent. And that was an act of integrity over reason. There was plenty of reasons for them to badmouth the other people. There was plenty of ugliness, and they never did. And one time I said as an adult to my mom, that was pretty amazing that you never badmouthed dad. You had huge reasons to badmouth him. There's, awful things, and you never did. And she said, well, because there was a time that I really did love him and he was a great choice for you as a dad, and you are part of him, and putting him down in some ways is putting you down, and I never wanted to do that for you.
that is who you are today. Your mother's that maturity and wisdom, I think, is reflected in you and your maturity and wisdom, honestly. Um, all right. Well, we are getting a little bit later on our time, and I do want to talk a little bit about your life as an adult, as a mother, and and also just because it's so interesting that you had this experience, with Broadway and parenting while he's off doing these shows and traveling. What was that like? Tell me just a little bit about what was that like, being a young mother and trying to keep the stability for your kids after your childhood?
Well, I think Rob and I both acknowledge the trauma we came from and not acknowledge the pain of that. And both individually worked and together worked really hard at kind of cleaning house so that we could provide a clean space for kids that we brought into the world. So we did our best. And uh, because we operated off of the same tenet that family was really important, um, we kept our family together as best we could. So, yes, Rob's career did bring him on the road and such. And when I had my career and he had his before kids, that worked. But once we had kids, probably about a year in, it became clear that this isn't why we created a family to be apart. So we had a rule that he couldn't go 10 days without seeing the family. And so if he did short stints or whatever, he might do 10 days and then would be home for several weeks or whatever, or if he did locally. But there came a time when we went on the road as a family and we traveled and we lived in different parts of the United States for several months at a time. Um, that was really important for us to stay together. Um, I will say though, it's hilarious because coming from, and I'm imagining some of your guests would feel the same way. Coming from a chaotic kind of broken home, your goal is like, "I'm gonna be like June Cleaver. I'm gonna
Yeah,
have everything on the table at this I'm gonna this idea that somehow that's gonna make things safe and okay, excuse me. So what is funny is that here I married this guy who goes around and, we have a family and we used to joke that we're circus people. And so externally it was kinda chaotic, but it was special in that, we were all together and we did some really unconventional things. We homeschooled our kids so we could be together. So being together was really important.
really interesting. Did he and I imagine he was gone at night doing these performances regularly, right? I mean, that would have been hard
Well,
to.
it's funny though, because think about it, performances are at night. So you have little
Yeah,
kids, they're in bed. Dad gets
yeah,
to read them a book and go to bed. They don't even know. We used to make jokes when we moved back here and lived in, when he was pretty much when he retired too. And he retired at a really young age. We would joke around that he saw his kids more than the investment banker because he could read them a book to bed, then he'd go do his show, then he'd come back the next day, he'd be awake and take them to preschool and then come home. And it's like he saw them more than kind of conventional 9 to 5 dads.
that's
So
so
we were
interesting.
lucky in that way.
Oh,
Mhm.
interesting. I love it. Well, what's next for you in your life? I know you've got a new
That's a really
grandchild.
good Yeah, that's a really good question. I think what's next for me has always been what's next for me, whatever it is that I'm doing. I I I want to live more I want to live in a way that um represents what I like to do, lets people know who I love, that I love them, and just fulfill the gift that I have, the life that I have in whatever ways um do that for me and for others. Yeah, I really don't, especially coming from the childhood I did, I do not undervalue the choices I have. And I want to honor those choices that have been given to me by living fully, whatever that looks like today. Sometimes it's just like binge watching something. Sometimes it means doing something philanthropic. Sometimes it means art, whatever it is. I
That's
want to live
beautiful.
that gift.
That's beautiful. Well, before we finish this out, because you do have so much to put out into the world, And I know you've already shared a lot of wisdom and thoughts during our conversation, but do you have anything you might say looking back to somebody who's a stepchild right now dealing with divorce or a step parent? I loved some of your wisdom about step parenting, but do you have anything you might want to share just as a parting thing?
Well, I think that it's really, yeah, I'd like to share just my experience that, that having, this layer of complication to a family, I think it could be really easily able to focus on external things. So focus on whatever externally happened. And for me, I would encourage people to really go inward and instead of looking at what happened to me, not to bypass that, but to say, yeah, these things happened. And so now how do I want to handle that? And um, the past is the past and have your grief over that, but to for me, it's been a discovery about accepting what has happened and being able to choose what to do next. And a huge part of that for me, especially coming from an alcoholic home, was working a 12-step program. And I have found that to be really healing because the focus isn't on, like I mentioned before, the pain Olympics. The focus is on the gift that you received from this. And the source isn't out there, it's really in here to heal. And there are many people that are there to support you and many groups that can support you in that process. It's probably the most loving thing you can do for the people around you is to heal yourself so you can be a fully um, loving person to them without resentment or anger or hostility. And so, um, kind of cleaning up my house has been the best way to invite people into my home and to love them up.
And you are such a love, and you are such a wonderful friend. And I so appreciate you talking to me today and being on my show and sharing your life. So thank you again. And I hope that your experiences, and not, I hope is the wrong word. I know that your experiences will help somebody who listened today who is looking back at their past or they're in the thick of it with some good ideas and some wonderful way of thinking. So thanks again, Erin.
Wow. Thanks, Robin. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.